Right, so if you are just joining us today, this is our next class here at 1 o'clock from the Fairbanks Museum and Planetarium, The Need for Species with Bobby Farlice-Rubio. Just want to share out a couple of ways that you can share your questions with us today. If you are joining us on Zoom, you can go ahead and either use the chat box. So when you mouse down, you'll actually see a little black bar pop up with chat written on it. You can click on that one, or there is the Q&A section. You can also open that. And for people on YouTube, there is a chat section on there. And if you go ahead and add anything to that area, I can move those questions over to Zoom and Bobby can answer those as they come in via YouTube. So we are happy to help you guys out in any way. And we would love to have your questions. So feel free to ask them at any time and I will just raise my hand and interrupt Bobby to get him to answer those. And again, we will be meeting tomorrow morning for at 9:05 for the lifespan of a star, but please check our website for any of our scheduled classes that are online right now. But I will go ahead now and hand it over to Bobby Farlice-Rubio. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Leela, and thanks everyone for tuning in to watch our live webcast here. This lesson is called The Need for Species, and what this class is really about is, as you might see behind me, the big word called biodiversity. Biodiversity just means lots of different types of life. And to get an idea of what this means, think about it in a different way. Imagine listening to a radio station that only played one song. I hope it's not Baby Shark. Imagine going to a restaurant that only had one piece of food on the menu and that was the only thing you could order. I hope you like mashed potatoes because that's all we've got. I don't think most people would appreciate going to a restaurant like that, or they wouldn't want to listen to that radio station that plays only one song. And then when you think about life, you can also apply that too. What if there was only one type of bird? I love chickadees, but if that was the only kind of bird, I would feel the forest would be a lot poorer in all the wonderful colors and all the beautiful songs that we hear. So in one sense, biodiversity is just appreciating the fact that life has a lot of variety. But when I want to talk about biodiversity today, I'm not just talking about how beautiful all these creatures are. I want to talk about how the fact that there are so many different species isn't just a cool feature of life. It is an essential feature of life, without which life would not exist. We need new species to constantly evolve on this planet because new situations, new environmental catastrophes, new chemicals present in the environment are constantly happening, not just because of humans, but also for natural causes. Like think of what happened to the dinosaurs when a giant meteor the size of a small town crashed into the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. That was a change that not every creature on Earth was ready for. Some creatures had evolved adaptations that allowed them to survive, and others did not. And when kids think about the dinosaurs, most people understand that as a mass extinction event. Well, the Earth has had many mass extinctions. Many times life has been nearly wiped out, but always some creatures survive. And it wouldn't be possible for some creatures to survive if they were all exactly the same. So before we get going in this whole exploration of biodiversity and how it allows creatures to survive, I want to start by sharing a picture that is actually usually on display in the main hall of the Fairbanks Museum. If you go upstairs in our balcony area, you can see artwork that was made by Dave McCauley, a good friend of the museum's. And this is a picture that is on the wall, and it shows a spiral of time starting from the beginning of Earth at the bottom of the picture, 4.6 billion years ago, all the way to the present, which is at the top right of the picture, where you see a little number 6 with a question mark. Well, let me zoom in on parts of this picture. I'm going to try to walk you through some of the sections, but let me just start with a fundamental fact that we need to understand. It's just written right here. Life on Earth has been in a state of flux since its origins some 3.5 billion years ago. Life has been around for a long time. Approximately 3 billion 960 million, or 99% of the 4 billion species estimated to have evolved are extinct. Now, we actually don't know exactly how many species there have been, but we do know that most life has gone extinct. But there's a natural levels of extinction that happen in the background, and then there's mass extinctions when a lot of creatures go extinct at the same time. I'm going to skip to the last paragraph there where it says, however, extinction rates can be considerably higher. The past 540 million years have witnessed 5 mass extinctions. During each extinction, the Earth lost more than 70% of its species. Biotic recovery, which means how long it took for the life to recover from that terrible mass extinction, took somewhere between 5 to 30 million years. So when kids think of the dinosaur going extinct, that's just one of the mass extinctions. That's actually the one that's labeled number 5 right here. At the end of the Cretaceous, see the T-Rex on one side of the line, but no T-Rex on the other side of that line. And if I go back in time, you can see that that one that happened to the dinosaurs was just the most recent mass extinction. We had one that happened between the Triassic and the Jurassic, and one that happened between the Permian and the Triassic. And this one, number 3, has a special name. A lot of folks call it the Great Dying. That's because up to 90% of the creatures on Earth went extinct at that time, 252 million years ago. So look at it this way. Everything that's alive on Earth today is descended from that 10% that survived. I'm still alive, like the grandma says in Cruise, right? We are still alive. We are the descendants of the survivors of all of these mass extinctions. So that's something to take pride in, and that's something to feel good about. We're tough. We have DNA that has adapted and evolved and survived all of these terrible things through all the different species that our ancestors have been. But the cause for concern today is that we may be going through a mass extinction right now caused by human activity, primarily things like habitat destruction, pollution, and now, of course, climate change. All of these pressures that humans put on the world are causing species to go extinct. And that's something I'm going to talk about in this class. I'm going to even show you some resources online where you can go and find out which creatures are more extinct and which ones are coming back, which ones are endangered and which ones are threatened. All of that is available on a website I'm going to show you in a little bit. But I also want to mention a little bit about local history here in Vermont. If you look at where it says Pleistocene epoch and Holocene epoch, you can see that there's a little magnification lens, like a little window that looks like it's zooming in. And that white stripe that appears right there represents the last ice age. And that last ice age ended around, well, as you see, 11,700 years ago. That's the time when the glaciers of the ice age melted and Vermont's land was exposed. And during that time, we in Vermont could have seen mammoths and mastodons, elephants, furry elephants that are now extinct, but were able to live here at the end of the ice age. So just think of the diversity of life that has lived in Vermont even since just the last 12,000 years. Is there a question, Leela?
Yeah, we were looking at what was the first mass extinction? So I think you might have mentioned it, but just to review what that first one was.
No, I didn't go into detail with all of them. So the end Ordovician mass extinction, number 1, is 443 million years ago. Now, just to give you an idea of what Earth was like at that time, none of the continents that you know today existed. They were in a very different configuration, and almost all of the animals on Earth lived in the ocean. There was no land animals. There were maybe some microorganisms and maybe algae growing on the rocks on the ground, but everything that was an animal was living in the ocean at that time. And that was the time when there were lots of ammonites and trilobites. So if you come to the Fairbanks Museum in the future, when we're reopened, you'll be able to see some of the fossils from that Ordovician and Cambrian period. And 443 million years ago, something wiped out most of that life. Now, it's so long ago that we're not exactly sure as to what caused that first mass extinction. It could have been a meteor, but there's actually some compelling evidence to say that it also could have been an even stranger cause, a gamma ray burst in a nearby star in the cosmos, something that accompanies collisions between stars and also supernovas. a burst of gamma rays may have struck the Earth at that time and caused a lot of the ocean to get irradiated and also to be filled with toxic chemicals as a result of that gamma radiation that would have caused a lot of life to go extinct. So that first mass extinction may have had extraterrestrial origins, but not ET and aliens zapping us, but maybe a star blowing up and zapping us. So outer space can cause mass extinctions. Number one might have been caused by a supernova or gamma ray burst. Number five, we have compelling evidence to believe was caused by a meteor crashing into the Earth. And there's also volcanic activity that happened 66 million years ago that could have contributed to the mass extinction of the dinosaurs, sort of like a 1-2 punch. The meteor and then the Deccan Flats in India forming at the same time could have caused so much climate change that it doomed most of the dinosaurs. But those of you who love dinosaurs will know it didn't doom all of them, because that chickadee I mentioned is a descendant of the dinosaurs. So we have dinosaurs today, but only thanks to biodiversity, only thanks to the fact that some of the dinosaurs had adapted and evolved strange traits like flight that allowed them to survive the thing that caused the T-Rexes to get barbecued. Yes, we have another question.
There we go. Sorry. Someone was asking, what is the yellow part? And I wasn't sure. Maybe it's towards, is there a yellow section in your graph?
Oh, I'll explain. I'll go back to that. I think they're referring to the part of the coil where we don't have a lot of pictures of cool animals.
Yes.
And if you go back to this area, the Precambrian, as they call it, Ediacaran here, the Proterozoic, I actually don't know how to say that correctly, Proterozoic eon. These are not words that I use on a daily basis. Sorry, folks. But those eras are times when life was almost all microscopic. And we have a lot of evidence of bacterial life going back to that period. But these were creatures that did not have bones, did not have shells, so they did not leave obvious fossils like what you get with later larger life. So the earliest life on Earth, all the bacterial life, we see evidence of it in rocks based on things that they leave, like voids, cavities, and formations in the rock that are very tiny, microscopic. That's a different kind of paleontology than what you do if you go to a beach on Lake Champlain and kick over a shell from a fossil ammonite and see something that lived in Vermont hundreds of millions of years ago. So these creatures, they could have lived here. There was a time when Vermont was covered by ocean. And then when our mountains rose, we would have had different life, like those dragonflies that flew through the forest that became the coal that we use as a fossil fuel. So when you think about the coal that people burn, most of it was formed during the Carboniferous period. And that's from forests that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. So this is the long coil of time, and I could spend a whole class just going over what's on this diagram. But I wanted to talk about how biodiversity is the thing that allows us to survive these horrible mass extinctions. And of course, if humans today realize that we are possibly causing a mass extinction, well, if we want to prevent that, one of the things that we need to do is preserve biodiversity by making sure we have as many species around as possible. And I don't think that's a thing that's hard to convince most people that is a good thing. I mean, everybody wants to see these animals. Nobody wants to see great creatures go extinct. But this time, it's different from the meteor coming from outer space. We couldn't do anything about that. The T-Rex didn't have NASA. The T-Rexes didn't have a space program where they could launch a rocket and stop the meteor from crashing into the Earth. But we do. We have those technologies. So maybe in the future, we could prevent a mass extinction. But the mass extinction that's being caused by human activity is also something that we can prevent. So we're not powerless in this one. In number 6, the 6th extinction, the power is in our hands, and humans can decide to change our behavior and stop more creatures from going extinct. So I feel good about that, in that it's something that we can choose to stop from happening, unlike a meteor from space where you don't have as much choice. So let me move on to talk about something else. I'm gonna show you guys a little video that I think will help you understand how biodiversity works, but it won't take millions of years for new species to emerge. This video was made by folks at the Harvard Medical School, and they wanted to demonstrate how bacteria like one of the bacteria that can be harmful to people, E. coli. They wanted to show how these bacteria can evolve in the presence of something that's very dangerous to them. So think of antibiotics to stop many infections from hurting people, but antibiotics are essentially a poison to bacteria, and adapt and evolve and change their DNA so that the next time they encounter that antibiotic, it doesn't kill them, they can survive. So think of the antibiotic as sort of the agent of extinction, and think of the bacteria as being creatures that can rapidly evolve and adapt to see if they can survive. And when we get to the end of this video, I hope we have some great questions to ask, but this is video that is a little scary looking if you're thinking about disease and bacteria and infections. But this is actually a creature that can evolve in a matter of hours and days, as opposed to in a matter of thousands or millions of years, like creatures as big as us. So let's jump over to this video, and this video is available on YouTube through Harvard Medical School, so you could definitely watch it on your own. And I'm going to hit play and just let it go. Now that video is done, and I'm glad if you enjoyed seeing that. It may terrify you if you are afraid of bacterial infections, but I'm going to back it up a few seconds into the video to show you this section where they talked about the successive mutations. I don't know if you folks see it when you look at this diagram, but what I see there is a family tree. And it's what a scientist might call a phylogenetic tree, tracing how different adaptations led to others. And if you remember what the scientists were talking about in this video, they're talking about mutants, meaning not X-Men like Wolverine and Storm, but mutants, meaning that they had changed DNA from their ancestors. Something happened in the process of making a new E. coli, and some of them turned out to be freaks. And if I back up the video to a second where you see them appear, the first mutant that appeared on the right over there, that was a freak. It was a mutant E. coli bacteria that somehow could survive the poison that killed all of its ancestors. So crossing that boundary was like going through a mass extinction, except there was a couple that said, we're still alive. And they were able to survive in that antibiotic-filled zone. And you can see that they weren't the only ones. On the left and on the right, more mutants appear. And as we go through, they go from the 1 antibiotic to the 10 times antibiotic zone. Same thing happens. A mutant freak appears that is able to survive something that killed off almost everyone else. So if you think about that happening over and over again, every time they pass into one of these new bands, it's almost like a mass extinction. And when we get to the one in the center, just think of what that means. that bacterial colony that you see in the middle there, those mutants can survive an amount of poison that killed 1,000 times more, 1,000 times more poison than would have killed their great grandparents. So this is evolution in 11 days. Bacteria reproduce very quickly, so it shouldn't surprise you that they can have this kind of progression in a short period of time. But I want you to focus on the fact that this looks like a family tree. This is just within one species, and most of them would not make it, but the few mutants that are in the center are now able to survive 1,000 times more antibiotic than their ancestors. So I'm going to stop this video and let me see if anybody can see any connection with that picture to a totally different picture that I'm going to share with you now from, let's see. Uh-oh, you're going to see all the crazy stuff I have open on my desktop. But let's look at this picture for a second. Does this look at all like that thing with the bacteria? Maybe you're saying, what does this have to do with dinosaurs? But notice those branches. Notice how at the end of every branch here, there's a different species. And what this is also telling us in this diagram is that we can see which kinds of feathers the different dinosaurs had. So you may know that that meteor came 66 million years ago, crashed into the earth, changed the environment so quickly that most of these dinosaurs went extinct. But if you look at the bottom right of this picture, there is a type of dinosaur that still is around, and that one looks like a duck, and that's a modern bird. And it shows you in the diagram the different kinds of feathers that modern birds can have today. And we know from the fossil record that other dinosaurs had feathers too. In fact, there were lots of dinosaurs that had feathers that could never fly. So it makes you wonder how, this is such a weird thing. Feathers existed before there were flying birds. So I know I can't see all of your faces, but I wonder if anyone has any ideas as to why would a dinosaur evolve feathers, and what good would it do for a dinosaur if it had nothing to do with flight? Why would the first dinosaurs have had feathers in the first place? Even T-Rex, we now know, was covered with fuzzy feathers, which might ruin it for you to think that T-Rexes and velociraptors look more like this. That's a velociraptor based on what we know now about the fossil record. And here's a dinosaur fossil that was found in China where the pigment of the feathers was still preserved. So if you look on the right, you can see in the fossil the actual feathers that decorated this sherbet colored dinosaur. It was very bright colored, and it probably used its feathers not for flying, but for what? Anyone out there answering, Leela? I'm just fishing for a question from the kids.
I don't see any yet.
All right. Well, here's something that can't fly that has feathers. A baby chicken. This is actually what a T-Rex probably looked like through most of its life. Just go re-edit Jurassic World and Jurassic Park and add the feathers back in. And I don't think anybody's going to think it's such a scary movie. They might have looked kind of cute, those T-Rexes.
We
have a question.
Sort of one comment or question. I think they mean, would the dinosaurs or would birds be able to devolve? Like, could they go back into a dinosaur?
Oh, this is a very fun question to answer. Now, it doesn't seem likely to happen for anything that I can predict, but nature has all kinds of things happen all the time nobody can predict. I mean, this is why we're online. Nature did something to us that has caused us all to have to do our lessons from home. So that's the kind of thing I cannot predict. But I'll tell you this, there is somebody who's trying to breed chickens to resemble their dinosaur ancestors. Jack Horner, a famous paleontologist, has now gotten involved with a chicken breeding program. They're not doing GMO. They're not modifying their genes inside the cell. They're just doing what is considered standard chicken breeding. They're looking for certain traits. How do you think we got those funny looking bantams and those silkies and those other, barred rocks? All those different breeds of chickens come from humans manipulating their DNA, choosing which mutant, which freak is going to pass on its DNA. So Jack Horner is trying to get chickens to look like dinosaurs. And one thing they've discovered is that while chickens are developing inside of the egg, there's a time in their development when they have teeth in their mouths. Now, they don't have teeth when they're born, when they hatch. And they also have claws on their wings when they're in the egg. So what they're trying to do is get a chicken to develop by breeding that would hold on to its traits, hold on to its older characteristics, so that when it hatches, it looks like a velociraptor instead of like a chicken. So they want to call it a Chickosaurus. Maybe you'll be able to get them from Murray McMurray, the hatchery in the future. I don't know. But that's human artificial selection. That's people breeding the bird to look a certain way. That's how we got all the horses and all the cows. Those are all based on humans' choices for the animal, based on a wild ancestor. So nature, I don't think nature wants to make a new dinosaur, but I can't predict what nature will do. Yes, another question.
We have a good. Do you think in the future birds can evolve without either feet or wings? Do you think there'll be a big change like that?
I don't know, unless they get around by slingshots like Angry Birds. I don't know how would they ever evolve that. But this is what's great about biodiversity, is that nobody alive today can predict what nature is going to require of life in the future. And you don't know which animal. There could be organisms right now that are barely surviving, but they have a trait that will make them perfect for the world of the future. So this is why biodiversity is necessary. We need all of the freaks in nature to survive, because we don't know which one has the DNA that's going to be the right DNA for the future. Maybe if you were a dinosaur living 67 million years ago before the meteor came, maybe you saw one of those flying bird dinosaurs, you would have thought, that's weird. What's the point of that? I can't imagine that would ever survive. That little fragile thing is so easy to kill. It's so tiny, so light, but then the meteor comes, and who's laughing now? The ones who can fly, the ones who can survive. Yes.
So another question that's what did dogs evolve from? So looking back in the historical record at dogs as well.
Well, dogs, all dogs on Earth today are descended from wolves. The gray wolves that are thought to actually have been from Asia. Even the dogs that Native American cultures had in America were originally from Asian wolf DNA, which is a fascinating thing, because that kind of tells us the history of how humans migrated across the earth. But all dogs are descended from wolves, and technically speaking, they're still within the same species, meaning humans have been messing with the DNA by saying, look at that little chihuahua, can we keep it? It probably would never survive in the wild, but that little freakish mutant is so cute. And then you take it home, and then you raise it, and then you create a new breed, like a chihuahua or a Pekingese, or any dog you think of, a poodle. Those are all based on humans choosing a weird mutant trait that they found in something that was originally a wolf. But despite the fact that dogs come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and all those different breeds, they are still genetically compatible with wolves. And that's why it's still possible to make wolf hybrids, which is to take a wolf and a dog and mate them together, and you get a half wolf, half dog. In fact, in a weird way, nature is doing the same thing here in the forests of New England, here in the Northeast Kingdom. A hunter recently shot a coyote, and coyote hunting is allowed here. But when they took that coyote into the Fish and Wildlife Service, they noticed that the coyote was 90 pounds, which is about twice the size of what coyotes usually are thought to be. And they checked the DNA of this coyote, and they found that it was actually half wolf. So what we have in our woods right now is a new experiment by nature. It's a hybrid, half wolf, half coyote, a new breed. Maybe we should call them wolf-odies. Another question.
So you sort of answered this with the Chickosaurus, but someone was asking, can there be new dinosaurs in the future? And then kind of a related one is, what was the lifespan of a normal dinosaur? Do we know?
Ooh. Now, dinosaur lifespans, I'm going to have to put that question aside, because that's going to vary so much from different species to different species. I've heard that many dinosaurs lived for decades, but that I wouldn't want to say one number to generalize it, because there are dinosaurs that were the size of small birds. There were dinosaurs the size of, the Fairbanks Museum, and they're all going to have different lifespans based on their species. But as far as re-evolving into a dinosaur-like creature, what do you think an ostrich is? Think about that for a second. An ostrich is a bird, but it can't fly anymore. It's become something that's a lot more like its dinosaur ancestors than like a chickadee. Or think of a penguin. A penguin is a bird, but it's evolved to be so aquatic that in the future, could you imagine something descended from penguins that never leaves the water? Kind of like how dolphins and whales used to be land creatures and now they're ocean creatures. So they don't necessarily have to go back and look like their dinosaur ancestors, but who knows what the birds of the future can do? What if birds is inventing? I'm just being silly, but I cannot predict the future, but that's why biodiversity is so amazing. By allowing so many various creatures to survive, you have more possible futures. You have more survivability for all of the life on Earth in the future. Yes, more questions.
So yeah, we've got two more. One is sort of going further back with the dogs, asking what were wolves evolved from? Like if we're going further back to like bears and seals, and like there must be some proto wolf out there.
Yeah, I don't have the names of the species in front of me, but I know that there is an ancient carnivore ancestor, and actually this will help me lead into the next thing. All the carnivores that we know have a common ancestor that was the ancestor of what became the cats and became the dogs and became things like the mongoose and the weasels, the mustelids. All of these different predator creatures came from one particular ancestor. Think of it as the proto-carnivore. So if you want to do the history of a dog or a cat, you can go back and eventually you'll find that you hit a crossroads where the ancestor of the cats and the ancestor of the dogs and the ancestor of the weasels, there's a point in which all of their paths meet. And you won't be able to say that they have different ancestors. They'll all have one common ancestor. And so since somebody asked me about dogs, it's funny that that's a good way to talk about it, but I was actually ready to talk about it with humans, okay? Because there's a few things that I wanted to show you folks. First of all, humans are the result of biodiversity as like any other form of life on Earth. And there was a time only 20,000 years ago or so during the Ice Age that there were 5 species of humans alive at the same time on planet Earth. There may be more. Scientists have discovered Homo Neanderthalensis more recently, and the Denisovan human, which was found as a few finger bones in a cave, have told us by their DNA that there may have been 7 or more species of humans alive on Earth at the same time. But today, there's only 1 species of human alive. And why? Well, I don't know. I wish I had a time machine and I could go back and see how all of the other species survived and didn't survive or went extinct. But there's a lot of evidence to show that we had the right stuff. We could survive the new environment that Earth had. Our other cousins that were very similar to us did not survive. For whatever reason, we are alive. And if it wasn't for that biodiversity, if there wasn't 5 or 7 or more human species at one point, maybe our kind would have never come into existence and all humankind could be extinct right now. But it's not because of the diverse numbers of species. And I want to go into that. But first, I want to change things up a little bit, and I'm going to suggest something that you could play as a game if you want to understand this whole concept of common ancestor and how mutants appear, like in that E. coli video when you saw the branching mutant family trees. Well, it's actually really easy to replicate this without getting into the nitty-gritty details of reproduction. Oh, don't worry, we're not going to go into that. But I do want to talk about genetic mutation. And the best way to understand how DNA can mutate is to think about a game that maybe many of you have already played, the telephone game. The telephone game is when you get a secret message and you have to whisper it into the ear of the next player, and then that player has to whisper it into the ear of another player, and then after several players have whispered the message, you hear what happens at the end, and usually the message is not the same as it was when it got started. Well, every time a creature reproduces, every time a mom has a baby, there is a transfer of DNA from one organism to another. And that DNA usually gets faithfully copied and most of it stays the way it was. That's why you look a little bit like your mom and your dad, but there's always some mutations. Out of all of the letters in your DNA alphabet, 1 out of 1 billion will get mistakenly copied. And that may not sound like much, 1 out of 1 billion, but if every generation keeps adding on these little mutations, changing the DNA in accidental ways, most of these mutations won't do anything. Some of them could be harmful. Some of these mutations could cause things like cancer. So obviously mutations are a dangerous thing to happen, and you don't want to have them happen too often, perhaps. But if there were no mutations in the DNA, there would be no change. There would be no evolution. So think about the E. coli in that petri dish. They had DNA, or some that had a mutant version of the DNA. They swapped out some of the letters, some of the adenosine. I'm not going to go into the A, T, C's, and G's. Don't worry, kids, if you're not up on how DNA works. But if you swap some of these letters, you change the way the organism grows and lives. And the ones that could survive the antibiotic had mutated this part of their cell, the DNA, the information that allows them to make copies of themselves. So let's think about this in a different way. I have a chalkboard or a whiteboard here that I'm going to pull in. Let's see if we can understand how humans got to be here on Earth and our closest cousins. So maybe some of you already know that of all the life forms on Earth, the one that has the DNA most similar to ours are chimpanzees. In fact, I could show you a couple of quick pictures of chimpanzees just to get everybody on the same page. Hold on a second. We're shuffling all over the place. We'll get to her later. But here, there's a creature, the bonobo, one of the species of chimpanzees. They like to smile. They like to hug each other. They like to kiss. And when you take their DNA out, it's 99% the same as any humans. Now, when people hear this, sometimes they get this idea that humans are descended from chimpanzees, but that is not the case. Chimpanzees are not descended from us. We're not descended from them, but we both have a common ancestor. Just like how the carnivores have a common ancestor. Before there was a cat, before there was a dog, there was a carnivore, proto-carnivore. Well, before there was a human, before there was a chimpanzee, there was something living in Africa 6 million years ago that was the ancestor of both of us. So I'm going to take this picture out and let's see if I hope everybody can see on the back. Here is this common ancestor, a creature that lived 6 million years ago. Okay? And let's imagine that this creature had 2 kids. Now, just for fun, let's say you want to do this as the telephone game at home. This is something that might require you organizing a lot of friends, and given the environment that we're in today, make sure you keep each other 6 feet apart. Maybe you want to actually use the real telephone to play this version of the telephone game. But let me diagram it for you here. Let's imagine that the DNA from this mother organism was actually a bunch of words that we could actually read. Instead of saying A, T, C, G, A, we could just say, her DNA says, I eat fruit and meat. Well, when she has her children, she passes on this DNA message to them. I eat fruit and meat, I eat fruit and meat. And that's the 2 kids, they're siblings. They're going to be very similar to each other. But let's imagine that while her children are growing up, before they become parents, something terrible happens in the part of Africa where they live. Doom Canyon appears. Something happens, a rift in the ground, a crack in the earth. And suddenly, brother and sister that used to live next to each other can no longer visit each other. Because as time goes on, the canyon gets bigger. And when sister on this side has kids, they never get to hang out with their cousins on this side. So now, like, imagine if you're playing a telephone game and mama says, I eat fruit and meat to her daughter, and then her daughter says it to the granddaughter here. And if on this side you have I eat fruit and meat going down on the son side, let me just label them to help everybody keep up. Daughter over here, son over here. Now, the gender does not matter at all. So just don't worry about that part. It's just in order for us to keep track of who's who. So mom's up here. She gives her son, I eat fruit and meat. And she gives her daughter, I eat fruit and meat. And then the Doom Canyon separates the cousins. So for millions of years, they can never hang out with each other. And that side keeps having kids. This side keeps having kids for 6 million years. Meanwhile, the land where these kids are being born is not staying the same. On this side, we've got a rainforest. That's what it was like when they all got started. But on this side, Doom Canyon is also causing the land, which is causing it to get drier, less rain. So this starts becoming a grassland and it stops being a forest. So all of the cousins on this side have to learn how to do things besides climb trees. They have to learn how to run. They have to learn how to use their hands to pick up stuff off the ground. And these lions that keep chasing them, they can't just climb up a tree and run away from them. They have to figure out a way to fight the lions. So maybe somewhere down the line, one of them starts inventing things like a spear so that it can fight those lions. Do the ones in the rainforest have to worry about that? They don't even see lions there. So they never had the need to invent that spear to defend their families. So let's imagine that this keeps going on. The telephone game is played for 6 million years. When you check in on this side, the rainforest family, the descendants of mom's daughter up here, maybe you find out that their DNA says, I eat fruits and termites. Okay, and you say, oh, that DNA used to be I eat fruit and meat, and now it's become I eat fruit and termites. It's mutated, it's changed, but it's still similar to what it was before. And let's imagine that 6 million years down on this side, the sun side, well, not only did they invent stone tools, but they also, because the grassland environment changed so much, their DNA had to change a lot more to adapt to it. And so instead of saying I eat fruits and termites on this side, it might say, I want to fly spaceships. And you're like, what? How did that start? Wait, I want to fly spaceships. I eat fruits and termites. These are two very separate messages. Could they possibly have ever come from one common message? Well, 6 million years ago, there was only one message, and it mutated into two very different messages. And if you were on the human side and you look over at your chimpanzee cousins, you may not think that you're that close to them, but you all have a common ancestor. So let me see, I hope this makes sense. And this is a lot more fun to play than to watch somebody draw on the board. But yes, Leela, what's the question?
So related to this, what was the species called that both we and the chimps descended from?
Now, that is not completely settled, but let me show you one of the candidates of a species that we have in the fossil record that could be a common ancestor. Hold on a second. What I'm gonna show you folks is a website that the Smithsonian has that is, I highly recommend if you wanna check this out on your own. But first, check out this picture. I just wanted to put some pictures to what we're talking about. This story I told about Doom Canyon separating the rainforest from the grassland is not that much of an exaggeration. The east side of the Great Rift Valley in Africa looks like this picture here. The Masai Mara is one of the habitats that we know the Masai people live there. It's an area that's mostly grass with a few trees scattered around. And look at the area where the chimpanzees live, the Congo rainforest. It's a completely different environment. And that split between those two habitats happened around 6 million years ago. So this was the divide on the Petri dish that caused us to have to mutate. Some of our ancestors, their environment didn't change. The environment for the chimpanzees didn't change as much from what their ancestors lived in than it did for us, who were kind of forced to leave the forest and move into a completely new landscape with new predators and the need for new technology. So let me go now to show you the website for the Smithsonian. They have a really cool website for the Hall of Human Origins, which you can in other times visit in Washington, D.C. And if you go to the interactive timeline, then you can see what looks like a diversity tree for humans. Think of the branching of the E. coli that we saw in that Petri dish. And these red bands that you see here represent the time spans which different species of our ancestry lived. And let me just make it plain. by going to the left side of the screen where it says present. This is the time we're in now. And right now, there's only one member of the Homo genus, Homo sapiens. We are the only humans on Earth right now. All of us belong to this one species. And you can see that it went into existence around 300,000 years ago. But it's not like we just popped out of an egg somewhere. We came to be from descending from other humans along these lines. And if you go back to where it says here, Sahelanthropus chadensis, this is from a fossil found in Chad, which today is a very desert-like area of the Sahara Desert, but it was a grassland once upon a time. Around 6 million years ago, there was a creature that looked something like this. This is a reconstruction made by a paleo artist. I think John Gertsch is the paleo artist that did all of the work at the Smithsonian. So a paleo artist, which I can talk about a little bit more in a minute, is somebody who reconstructs a fossil and tries to figure out what it looked like when it was alive based on the relic that we have in the ground. So this could be what Mom in our big diagram of the telephone game might have looked like. Some of her children went on to become chimpanzees, and some of her children went on to become us, but not all at once. It took millions of years. And if you go down the line here, you can see the diversity of different species of humans or human ancestors that came into existence. And for example, one that most of the folks may have heard of is Homo Neanderthalensis, the Neanderthal. Now, this is a kind of human that went extinct relatively recently, but actually a lot of scientists don't think they went extinct completely. They may have fallen in love with some of our ancestors because around today, most humans have a couple of percentage points, 1 to 4% DNA that comes from Neanderthals. So I'm imagining a Neanderthal Romeo and Juliet, where maybe a Neanderthal and a human of our species fell in love and had children, and those children were close enough to our humankind so they were able to blend in with the population, kind of like the wolf Odie going on in the woods right now. Maybe humans are sort of a blend of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens because they may not have completely gone extinct. Some of their DNA lives on with us. So this whole timeline here is a great place to explore this. But instead of just showing you on the timeline, I've actually collected some of the pictures of what some of these human ancestors may have looked like. Notice that Homo sapiens is here, but right next to Homo sapiens is Homo erectus, one of our ancestors that lived on Earth for about 1 million years. That was a very long surviving species. And this species is also the one that learned how to use fire. So it wasn't even our species that pioneered how to make fire. It was actually our predecessor ancestral species, the Homo erectus. But at the same time as Homo erectus was going out of existence, starting to fade away, other Homo species that were descended from Homo erectus came into existence. Homo sapiens is one of them, but there's also Homo floresiensis, known as the Hobbit, colloquially, a tiny human, and the Neanderthal that we already mentioned. But let me skip from this to some actual pictures that might make this a little more fun. So let me go here, talk about Homo erectus. This is the work of an artist named John Gertsch. He takes the fossils that the Smithsonian has, and he actually goes to the zoo when they do dissections of apes like orangutans and gorillas and chimpanzees. When one of them dies and they do a necropsy, which is what they would call an autopsy on another animal, he goes and watches to see how the muscles and the tissues attach to the bone so that when he gets a fossil of an unknown creature, he can sort of reconstruct what it looks like. And so if you look at the screen, Homo erectus, they went extinct about 200,000 years ago, but not by completely going away, but they left the Earth as their descendants, new members of the genus like us, were coming into existence. And here is what an artist like John Gertsch would start with. He gets a fossil, and then he starts adding on the muscle, the tissue, the fat, the things that we all have, our skin, the eyeballs, the nerves. And eventually he gets a picture that looks like this. This is Homo erectus. This is one reconstruction of his. Here's another. And this is a creature that is an ancestor of humans, and their bodies were almost the same as ours. the biggest difference between us and Homo erectus is the size of our brain. Their brain was about half the size of ours, but they were still able to do things like make boats and to start fires. So this is a creature that is very similar to us. It's just a few generations ago. And just so you know, here's a footprint of a Homo erectus walking. I know a lot of people think it only has 4 toes, but look carefully between the big toe and the little toe, and in the second toe, and you'll see that there's another toe sticking up there. Their second toe is longer than their big toe.
You might need to share the PowerPoint that you're showing, because right now it's not coming up. But if you go back to share screen and
I'm sorry,
it's okay. I just wanted to make sure people could see what you were looking at.
All right, I thought that was up there. I'll try that again.
Perfect. Yep.
Okay, there's the footprint there. So if you can see my cursor, there's a toe print that's hard to see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Notice that they didn't leave a heel print, because just like people who live in places where they don't have shoes, most people just walk on their tiptoes, the way like little toddlers walk around before they learn how to walk with shoes on. So now that is just one of the species that is in the human biodiversity ancestral tree. We are descended from Homo erectus. Some of us have Neanderthal DNA. And actually, I want to put up a picture of that because John Gertsch made a Neanderthal. Let me see if I can show that to you guys now. Here's one of his reconstructions that's at the Smithsonian. And this is one depiction of Neanderthals. Now, a lot of people use Neanderthal as an insulting term. They say, oh, that guy's so dumb, he's a big Neanderthal. But that's not really fair. Neanderthals may have had a sort of tough appearance to them, but actually their brains were about the same size as ours. And we now know that the Neanderthals made art and also made musical instruments. And we also know that when they buried their dead, they poured bunches of flowers into the graves with their dead. So I would say that Neanderthals are a lot more like us than you might suspect based on what you see in movies and TV. But when they found a Neanderthal bone that had DNA still inside of it, they were able to take that DNA out and figure out what that creature looked like based on the DNA. And now we know that Neanderthals had features that we see in people today, like red hair and light colored eyes. So here's a Neanderthal woman that the reconstructors called her Wilma as a joke. If you're a fan of the Flintstones, you may know Wilma was Fred Flintstone's wife. And there's a picture of a child too that were reconstructed based on the DNA found in their bones. So now we know that Neanderthals would have even looked like a lot of people do today. You wouldn't have necessarily been able to tell from appearance that they were a different species. And they probably hybridized with us, meaning some of them fell in love with us, and here we are today, a hybrid of Homo sapiens and Homo Neanderthalensis. So let me see if you folks can. So is there any more questions from anybody else out there? Oh, we're running low on time, and I don't want to spend all of it just talking about human ancestry, but I hope you realize that just like the dinosaurs and the birds, humans too, we are the result of biodiversity. We had many species of humans. Most of them went extinct except for us. And I think I'm just going to wrap it up by showing you one last example. This is perhaps one of my favorites because this was a recent discovery in an island called Flores in Indonesia. They found the creature that we now lovingly call the Hobbit. And I don't mean the Hobbit from J.R.R. Tolkien's novels. No, I'm talking about the Hobbit that lived in this hole in the ground. This is a cave in Flores, Indonesia, where archaeologists and paleontologists were able to find this skeleton. And at first they thought this might be a freak of its own kind. Maybe it was a human that had some kind of abnormality that made it extra tiny. But then after they kept digging, they found that there were many skeletons of this size, and they spanned a period of thousands of years. So this wasn't just one individual freak, but an entire population of tiny humans. And here's one of the anthropologists that found the fossil of the Hobbit. So look at that. It's a creature that lived only up until 17,000 years ago and was a half-sized human, half the size head, half the size body, still were able to make fire, tools. They had boats. They lived on an island that you could not reach without a boat. So just imagine 5 types of humans on Earth at the same time. It makes you wish you could time travel. It feels like something out of a fantasy story, but that is where we come from. Sadly, they've all gone extinct except for us. So biodiversity, humans are beneficiaries of it. Every other form of life on Earth would not be here if it wasn't for biodiversity. So maybe, I want to jump to something else before we run out of time. I'm going to share the screen with you folks on a couple of resources that you can use if you want to keep track of what is going on as far as extinction and endangered species are concerned. So here I have, this is the Smithsonian website we were looking at, but one of the international organizations that is mostly directed towards preserving species is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And this website here is where you can find out where the numbers of certain creatures are right now. And the Vancouver Island marmot, they're decreasing, but sometimes you see good news, like this ancient kind of horse. This is what the ancestor of all horses would have looked like. The Przewalski's horse, they're increasing in population. So when you look at the numbers, though, it's not that encouraging to find out that 41% of amphibians, 25% of mammals, 34% of conifer trees, 14% of birds, 30% of sharks and rays, 33% of coral reefs, and 27% of crustaceans are in danger with extinction. This is a serious thing, but there's always good news in this too. The more you track species, the more you get surprised to find out how many there are. And locally in our state, we have a group called the Vermont Center for Eco Studies that they're maintaining the Vermont Atlas of Life, where they're asking folks to go out there and track whichever species they find and make a report so that they can keep tabs on who's around. And the good news is that just last summer, in the last couple of years, they discovered that if you look in their news section, they found over 320 species of bees in Vermont. So, this is also in the news. If you look right here, a bird that is actually a tropical bird was seen here in Vermont, the rare crested caracara. And you might say, what's that bird doing up here? Well, maybe it's a freak that's looking for a new habitat that its species hasn't lived in before. And maybe in the future, that bird will become part of Vermont or not. So, just thinking about all those things, and whenever life does something new, it could be a path that allows it to survive into the future in a world that continues to change. So just to wrap things up a little bit, the bad news going on right now, you may have heard last year that the United Nations made a report where they basically realized that about 1 million species are threatened with extinction. So this is a direct threat to biodiversity, and humans would be wise to do everything possible to prevent these species from going extinct, because we don't know which one of these species could be the future of a certain kind of life. After all, some of these species may contain substances that could be cures for diseases for humans. Some of the plants that are going extinct might have the cure for cancer in them, and we will never know if we let them go extinct. So there's a lot of different reasons for humans to protect biodiversity. And I wanted to point out some fun ways that you can participate in the hunt for new life. There's a YouTube channel and a website for a ship called the EV Nautilus. This is the exploration vessel that has a really good internet connection through satellite, so they can beam live streams of all the things that they are finding. And they take their submarine out, robotic submarines, and every time they go out, they seem to discover a new form of life. So it's not all bad news out there. When you're talking about biodiversity, right now, we as humans have more tools to find out more information about all the life out there. Exploring the ocean is something that we still have not nearly done in a complete way. And the ocean has most of the life on Earth. So when you watch the videos of the EV Nautilus, you might be watching something that's never been seen by human eyes before. So this is a fun way to participate in the quest for exploring biodiversity. So maybe, unless I have any more questions, I'm going to wrap things up. I'm going to show you guys. Let's see if you can still see what's on my screen. I want to show you some of the good news. Some of the species that have just recently been discovered that we didn't even know about. Just to show you that nature and Earth is still surprising us on a constant basis. In 2013 in Ecuador, scientists discovered the first predatory mammal that's been discovered in almost a century, the olinguito. But if you look at it carefully, you might recognize that it is closely related to raccoons. In fact, it has a common ancestor with the raccoon that might be raiding your garbage can tonight. So this is another species that was not known. And off the coast of Australia 5 years ago, they found a nice color version of a sea dragon. There's leafy sea dragons, there's other sea dragons, but this ruby colored one was totally new to scientists only 5 years ago. And off the coast of California, there's ghost shrimp like these, pretty creepy looking, but a form of life unknown until recently. And if you've watched Finding Nemo, you may have seen that Nemo's classmate looked like this. There was an octopus in that movie based on something that they found off the coast of California. This species of octopus still has not been fully named. It's just been seen many times by submarine cameras. And then even in a place like New York City, they discovered a new variant of the leopard frog, a frog with a much darker color. In fact, this one was actually found on Liberty Island, which is technically in New Jersey, where the Statue of Liberty is. So is it possible that the New York City environment is creating a new type of life form, maybe a new kind of frog that is better suited for living in an urban environment than in the swamps of the rural parts of Vermont where we see our leopard frogs? Well, in India, they have a new kind of frog discovered only 3 years ago, Robin Moore's night frog. So in Australia, a construction worker was lifting a cinder block at a house construction site and found a kind of snake that no one had ever seen before just 2 years ago. And off the coast of Antarctica, swimming alongside those penguins are this weird colored shrimp. And in Indonesia, in the ocean, they found sea slugs with these amazing pastel colors. And a spider in the Philippines that doesn't just use a web to catch its prey, but it actually uses the web as a weapon. It turns that web into a catapult so it can sling towards the prey and catch things that way. And that's a completely different way of hunting. So just think about that. How many spiders make normal webs versus this pioneer of a new technology here? And yes, an elephant shrew, a sengi from Namibia. Believe it or not, as strange as it might seem, that creature shares a common ancestor with elephants. Look at the trunk. Just imagine how many different mutations along the telephone game had to happen to go from something that size to something that's the size of your house. And here's a fish that was found in the coral reefs near Brazil, named after the goddess of love, Aphrodite, because of its wonderful colors. So, and here's another story in biodiversity. This is a creature that was thought to have been extinct since the 1930s, but recently in Vietnam, they found a population of these very funny looking snub-nosed monkeys. And that's the last creature I'm going to show you today, just to give you an idea of the fact that we still don't know all that's out there. And luckily, there is a lot more life that's still waiting to be discovered. But we don't have to discover all the forms of life that are out there to know that we need to prevent another mass extinction from happening. So I hope that there are some more questions for me to answer. And if anyone else has any more questions, I would love to answer anything about what we talked about, human evolution or the bacterial evolution. It all is the same. It's just with bacteria, it takes days and hours. With creatures as big as us, it takes millions of years for these physical changes to happen.
I think it looks like you answered all the questions, and someone from YouTube thanked us so much for the great links and information that you gave. I want to say thank you so much, Bobby, for all of your energy and everything put into this class, and to thank everybody who joined us via Zoom and YouTube. Again, if there's any additional questions, please feel free to ask, but we will also be back tomorrow at 9:05 with the lifespan of a star. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for watching, everyone. Be well. Thank you, Leela, for doing a great job of hosting, and enjoy the biodiversity that you can in your backyard now that you're home.